we have a pretty serious problem when it comes to studying ancient histories and ancient cultures. And this problem is completely ignored by the scientific, historic, archaeological mainstream, but it's also ignored by the religious mainstream as well. In fact, just the religious, probably just religion in general for the most part. But both sides of these institutions, or whatever we want to call them, both of them have a very serious problem that they share and that they ignore. And that problem is the fact, and the absolute fact, by the way, it's a fact, that all ancient religions and ancient mythologies, they all have a foundational basis in the planet Saturn. Now, if you've never heard of this and you are listening and you're like, what the hell is this dude talking about? What do you mean the basis of all religions and mythologies has a basis in Saturn? Like, what the hell does that even mean? Well, it means exactly what I just said. You might be surprised to find out that, for example, Abrahamic religions, right? Christianity, Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, etc., right? Those religions can all be traced back to God essentially being Saturn, right? I know that sounds crazy, right? So I know you're about to turn this off and you're about to go back to, I don't know, watching porn or whatever it is you do. But hold on, stick with me. Now, what I just said is not just acknowledged by crazy people like me. I did not just create this out of nowhere and just to make a stupid video about it, right? No, the reality is when you start to get into, for example, Jewish scholarship, you start to look at the serious stuff, and you start to look at translations and you start to, trace everything backwards to see where the hell this came from, what we inevitably run into is, at the end of the day, we run into Saturn. All right, so right now it's crazy. Okay, I get it. So here's a problem. Now, it's not a secret that people worshipped Saturn back in the day, right? Everything I'm saying right now is acknowledged at least on some level of scholarship, and I mean mainstream scholarship. So, for example, the Judaism situation, that is acknowledged by Jewish scholars. That's not hidden. That's not some weird, conspiracy theory. Same thing with Islam, interestingly enough. When you trace it backwards that way, what you find is at the beginning there that Saturn was revered. To accentuate the point, for example, in Islam, if you look at the ritual of the Kaaba situation, right? Everybody, they go down there as a pilgrimage and they have to circle around it 7 times. We know through scholarship and for a fact, and it's not hidden, this is normal stuff, but I don't think a lot of people know about it, is that Kaaba is directly related to Saturn. All of those people walking around the Kaaba 7 times, right? That's people acknowledging Saturn through ritual. All right. Now, it goes deeper than that, but I just wanted to point out a quick example. Now, Saturn worship is not something that is ignored necessarily by mythologists and religious people, but it depends on the religion and the mythology you're talking about, and it also depends on how far those people really want to go back. So, for example, if you go look into Christianity and Catholicism, on the surface, or even, several layers deep, you are not going to find Saturn taking the center stage, right? But as you start to do real scholarship within that particular religion, right, what you find is you inevitably run into the term El, and you start to see that is associated with different verbiages, and then you keep going back, and then ultimately what you find is that Elohim, is directly related to and ascribed to the planet Saturn. So what is going on here? Now, I can give more examples, but I'm not going to do that. This is just an introductory into the Saturn situation because I want to start to build a foundation that we'll start going schizo on later. But I wanted everybody to get on board with some of the crazy stuff. And it's not even crazy because it's real. This is the stuff that actually happened. This is not me making stuff up, right? This is real scholarship. Even mainstream scholarship. For those of you who are skeptical, that's great. And stop this video or podcast or whatever the hell it is right now and go just Google some of this really quick. Google doesn't hide it either, right? One of the bastion of truth that Google is, all of this stuff is right there. It's just not put on display for the masses because it's weird, right? I mean, what are you talking about? All these people worshiping Saturn. But this is what we find, right? And it's not just Abrahamic religions. I know I started talking about that there, but I mean, it's all over the place. We have Romans, Greeks, Mesopotamians, right? All of these cultures, they all worshipped Saturn at the core. Now, I'm using the term worship. Now, worship did happen at certain points in history, but as you start to go further back in history and you start to try to piece together where the hell these religions came from and how they evolved and all of that stuff, what you start to find is that the further you go back, suddenly it's not really a religion anymore. Or suddenly the stories are no longer mythological in context. The further back you go, you start to see these, I'll just say stories that you're reading, they lose a religious connotation, even though the way they are worded will absolutely seem religious to you today, right? Because we've all been poisoned with certain religious overtures and all that kind of stuff. So, you'll probably still feel a bit of the religious because the stuff they're talking about is crazy initially. But as you start to go back, you start to realize that these people are not worshiping anything. They are not talking about God, for example, right? I mean, the core of religions is a god or gods, right? Now, the rule on my channel is every time you see the term God, or almost every time, it depends on context and the year you're talking about. But if you're talking about ancient cultures, anytime you see the word God, all you have to do is replace it with planet. Now, as we go back in time and we dig into these ancient texts and translations, what we find is that people are not worshiping a god. In fact, they're not really worshiping anything at all. You start to lose the religious context the further back you go, which is fascinating, by the way. I mean, you would think that religions would start out, religious. We've all been given this idea that, when religions spawn to life, it's all craziness and you bow down and you do whatever crazy religious stuff you do and et cetera, et cetera. But when you go backwards, you find that none of that stuff is happening. What you find when you start to go backwards in time is that you find that these quote-unquote stories, they aren't really stories at all. They start to feel like the people were simply recording their history. All right, let's put the brakes on for a second. Let's get the stage set up here so we can get into the right frame of mind and see where this takes us. Now, right now, I'm making the claim, and it's not just me making the claim, right? It's all kinds of scholars, mainstream scholars, by the way. For those of you who are still not entirely buying into alternative researchers, that's fine. Don't worry about it. I'm not using alternative research. I'm actually using really in-depth mainstream research. Anyway, the claim being made is that everybody back in the day worshipped Saturn. Now, we all know what Saturn looks like. It's a ball, it's got some crazy stripes on it, and it has rings, right? And the rings are probably the most prominent feature of Saturn, right? When you think of Saturn, you think of rings, I would imagine. If you don't, then seek help. There's something wrong with you, or you're not thinking about the right planet. Or you have achieved some other level of existence that is just far beyond my comprehension. All right. Anyway, whenever we think of Saturn, we think of the features. It's got a ring, it's got like the bands and the storms and stuff, right? That's the planet Saturn. Now, here's the thing. Today, we only know what Saturn looks like because we have some pretty damn good technology that has allowed us to get a closer look, right? So when we see pictures of Saturn like this, from NASA and stuff, it looks crazy. It looks cool. It's a big-ass planet, right? It's awesome. But the reality is, if we believe the mainstream and the theory of uniformity and all that garbage, the reality is our ancestors should only have been able to see this. Now, if you're listening, what I have on the screen right now, it's just a picture of the night sky. Right? If I came up to any of you and I say, "Hey, look, can you point out Saturn?" The vast majority of us, without any aid, are not going to be able to point out Saturn, unless you're a nerd. But other than that, there's nobody pointing out Saturn, right? You're just not going to find it. The average person has no clue where Saturn is. Like, I don't know where the hell it is. I don't see it. So this puts us in a weird conundrum, because we know for a fact that deep level scholarship into mythologies and into religions has delivered us information on the worship, or at least the deifying, of Saturn. But why would we deify Saturn? Why would we look up to the sky? Why would anyone look up to the sky and think, "Oh yeah, I'm going to worship that as what?" Well, as the creator. Right? Because Saturn, in all of these mythologies, is considered the creator. Now, why the hell would anybody think that Saturn is the creator of anything? When was the last time you prayed to Saturn for, I don't know, like a new car, or hopefully your butt stops itching? I don't know. But when was the last time you looked up to the sky and was like, "Oh man, I hope Saturn creates some more stuff for me to do whatever," right? Or Saturn, please don't create more problems for me, bro. I already am suffering. That is not happening. Nobody goes to church and wonders what Saturn's doing. Nobody sits at home staring at the wall and ponders, "Oh wow, why did Saturn create us?" Right? But when we start to look into mythology and religions, this is what is claimed. We find that the core here, that Saturn is taking credit, or being given credit, for creation. And that's legit. This is not schizo. I'm not even at the schizo stuff yet. This is just mainstream scholarship. Yeah, you're going to have to go dig for it a little bit, just because it's not going to be on the surface. You're probably not going to be able to go down to your local church or imam or whatever, and they're probably not going to know much, if anything at all, about the core or root of Saturn being in their religion. It's probably not going to happen. So you are going to have to step up your own research and be prepared to dive into subjects which you may think were already, completely figured out and locked down, or that you are under the impression of that is just, fictional garbage. You are going to have to get out of your comfort zone. Now that's okay, that's good. That's what we want to do when it comes to critical thinking. That's what we definitely want to do when it comes to employing the scientific method. So we're looking up to the sky, and we have to ask the question, why did the ancient ancestors, all of our ancient ancestors, decide that Saturn was the thing to revere? I'll just use the term revere, that's probably better. Revere as the creator. Right? Now, we've already kind of started to talk about how that's crazy. Nobody's looking up to the sky, and you don't see creation like that, right? Saturn isn't creating anything up there. So this begs the question, why do we find Saturn at the core, or the root, of all of these mythologies, and why do we find it in the context of a creator? This is important because it needs a real answer. Why does it need a real answer? Why do you care? Because I can see, right now you can come back and you can say, well, who cares? They were able to track Saturn back in the day for some weird reason, and they decided to make it the creator. Now, this would be fine if it was like one or two cultures that did this, right? That would be, okay, fine. A couple of the cultures decided to pick that particular pinpoint of light in the sky, and they revered it as the creator. They're crazy, and they just started going, doing whatever the hell they did with it. They just went crazy. Okay, fine. Whatever. You can do that. But the issue that we find, and that what I will do is I will cover more proof of this as we talk. Not in this show. This is the intro. But what we find is that all ancient cultures suffer from this precise, exact situation of having Saturn at its core. Now, this is a problem, right? So in ancient history right now, especially mainstream, all ancient cultures really should not have been talking to one another, right? Or at least the ones that are on separate continents. there's oceans in the way. There's no diffusion. Diffusion is a problem for a lot of historians. There's a lot of historians that are also cool with diffusion as well. But we have actually no reason to believe that diffusion would have been happening at this point in time, because that's a whole technology thing, and it's not relevant anyway, and we'll cover why later. Anyway, the point is that for all of those cultures to have had the exact same story, and I mean the exact same story, i.e. Saturn being worshipped as a creator, I mean, they would have had to have been talking to one another, right? Why would all of the ancient cultures do this? This is a legit question because we have so much evidence and so much scholarship that puts Saturn as the creator. So even if you are in the mainstream and you're following all the mainstream trash, you still have no choice but to acknowledge this. This is a real bad question too, right? Because we bring up the problem of the possibility of diffusion. If diffusion is real, now we have to start talking about the possibility of different technologies. No, I don't mean like internet technologies, but I mean technologies that basic history is not willing to give our ancient ancestors. If we have diffusion though, they're conquering the oceans, so that's a problem. But on the other hand, we don't necessarily have evidence of that level of diffusion. So it gets weird. So we get stuck in a situation, both in the mainstream and on the alternative side of research. Both sides of that coin finds itself in a bind. The mainstream bind comes with having to deal with trying to figure out how the stories were communicated, right? You can get into diffusion or you can get into that kind of stuff, but it's a problem because the further back we go, mainstream history says that our ancestors were not really that technologically advanced. So they probably were not conquering the oceans. But then it begs the question, why the hell does everybody have the same damn story? Right? So, okay, that's a problem. And if you're in the mainstream mindset, if you're still subscribing to all the mainstream stuff, that's fine. But you have to have an answer for this. Because everything I've said about Saturn being the core of these religions and mythologies, that's just a fact. There's nothing to argue with me about, by the way. So you have to figure out why that happened. All right. Now, the other problem that we see on the alternative research side is the alternative research side can say, I don't know, oh, aliens did it, or they had the internet, or whatever level of technology the far alternative side wants to give humans. They can get over the communication side, but then they run into the problem of why the hell is it Saturn specifically being talked about as a creator? So both sides have a problem. And I wanted to establish that so that everybody understands that regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, we have an issue that has to be addressed. We cannot ignore the fact that Saturn, for whatever reason, is front and center in our ancient histories. We have got to deal with this, right? We cannot ignore it. It cannot be ignored. The fact that everybody has it, that's something that needs to be dealt with. All right, so let's deal with it. How do we deal with this, though, right? All right, well, the first thing we need to do is we need to get into the center. All right, I kind of gave examples of both sides of the coin and the extreme sides, but let's just jump into the center and let's look at this and let's see where this takes us. Now, once again, if we look back up to the stars and we're going to say that Saturn is the creator, the first thing we should also be asking is, okay, why Saturn? Why not Mars or Venus or Jupiter or whatever other planet that our ancestors might have been able to see? Right? Why did they choose Saturn specifically? All right, well, this is where we will start to get into the actual mythologies and the actual religious stories. All right, not on this show. I'm not doing that right now. We're going to do that on other shows. This is just an introduction to get you kind of motivated and understanding that this is a problem in history. Now, the first step in solving a problem is to admit that we have one. And this is one hell of a problem that we have got to admit that exists whenever we are going to deal with trying to figure out what people were doing back in the day. Like, how did their cultures work? What were the events that they lived through, and what were the main events that changed history, right? That's some of the best stuff about learning history is trying to figure out what the hell happened. right? And so we know for a fact that something must have happened. Something must be going on in our past to where all of our ancestors suddenly decided to revere Saturn as the creator. So we can't ignore this. And what's even more interesting is that even as we go through the timeline of people's histories and we see the religions, come out of the original Saturn mythos, I guess we can say, and as the mythologies start to change, what we see is that throughout ancient history, as time passes, Saturn still plays a huge role, and I mean a huge role, in everybody's mythologies and religions. And I think that's one of the really interesting parts of the Saturn mythology, is that Saturn does not just go away. Right? Saturn was not revered for like a little bit of time, thousands of years ago, and then suddenly everybody forgot it. No. Over thousands of years, Saturn continues to play a giant role in everybody's religions and mythologies. And this is a fact. There's nothing to argue with here. So, for example, right, the Romans used to have the Saturnalia festival, right? And it was held in Saturn's honor. And it was a major celebration characterized by feasting and gift giving and partying and all this crazy stuff. But why? Why did the Romans have to have a huge festival to celebrate Saturn? Why not have a huge festival, I don't know, to celebrate Venus or Neptune or whatever, right? Why not the sun? Why? Saturnalia is one of the largest Roman festivals that we know of. And it's dedicated to Saturn? Like, why would the largest festival that we know of, or one of them, be dedicated to Saturn? Even more interesting is what they did to celebrate Saturnalia in honor of Saturn, right? There were weird things like role reversals. Masters became slaves, and slaves became masters. That's kind of a weird way to honor Saturn, right? But that concept is there, role reversals, and this is important. And we'll go over that importance later, but just remember it. For whatever reason, the Romans felt that role reversals were important when you revered Saturn. So that's odd. Another thing is the time in which Saturnalia was celebrated. So Saturnalia was, for whatever reason, celebrated in mid-December. Now, this will also be an important piece of information and evidence as we dig deeper into the whole Saturn thing. And I'm not going to get into it right now because we have too much other stuff to go over. Let me give you guys more examples. So it's not just Romans that kept that tradition going. The Romans did not create that tradition, by the way, right? And Romans called Saturn Kronos. There's a whole weird Saturnius Kronos thing going on. Lots to talk about there as well, right? And Saturn, Kronos, had to deal with time. Time will also be a very important aspect, attached to Saturn. Another question: what the hell does Saturn have to do with telling the time or anything with time, right? I mean, when was the last time you looked up to Saturn, if you could find it, and you were like, I better set my watch to Saturn? You've never done that. Nobody has ever done that. But for some weird reason, the Romans end up revering Saturn in a sense of time. Some sort of a chronological situation going on with Saturn. We'll get into that later as well. But see, these are all these little bullet points of evidence, and we're only talking about the Romans right now. I'll give more examples here in a second. But even just looking at the Roman, like a simple Roman festival that the reality is most people probably don't even know about, and even if you heard about it, you wouldn't have cared. You would have just been like, yeah, crazy Romans, drinking, partying, worshiping, whatever, who cares? And they did that back in the day, and they were all dumb. Yeah, they thought gods existed, and they couldn't figure out basic stuff. Right? That is not how it happened back in the day. We have no reason to believe that that is what was going on. So why were the Romans celebrating Saturn really in any capacity at all? I think that's probably one of the main points, is who cares? Why would you create an entire major festival that celebrates Saturn? All right, let's give more examples. So we also find Saturn in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, in ancient Mesopotamian mythology, Saturn is associated with the god Ninurta, who was linked to agriculture and warfare, just as the same thing that the Romans would link Saturn to as well. We also find the Phoenician religion. Now, this is a very interesting situation because the Phoenicians literally call their god El, E-L, right? And now, where do we find El? We find El in Abrahamic religions, right? That gets interesting. Oh man, the Phoenicians are crazy as well because the Phoenicians and the ancient Hebrews and oh man, they're probably all the same people. There's a whole other thing on that. But the main point to make here is that the Phoenicians also revered Saturn. Moving right along, we move to the Gnostic traditions, all right? And this is where Hermeticism is also incorporated. Now, what they do here is that Hermeticism and, Gnostic stuff, they start to associate things with all of the not all of the planets, but planets are very important. Well, planets are important to like all religions, but they all play very specific roles in religions and mythologies, and the Gnostic traditions are no different. Right? So the concept of the demiurge, who is a false god or a cosmic entity, is also sometimes linked to Saturn. Now the demiurge is also a whole other thing that, we'll get in maybe, we should do a demiurge show. That'd be fun. But anyways, the Gnostics, they're doing the same thing. They have Saturn in place of of like a god or the god. It's interesting that they will also call it a false god. Or, even more to the point, they even call it a cosmic entity. All right, that Gnostic traditions, they have it as well. Another area where we find huge associations with Saturn is the Kabbalah. Now, for those of you guys out there who are into the alternative stuff, you're well aware of the Kabbalah. But why is Saturn related to the Kabbalah, right? And there's going to be weird information out there, but what I want to do with this show is I want to show you guys that there's even more scientific information about why Saturn is Kabbalistic, right? Why the teachings involve Saturn at all. And we can show that, and we'll do that in later shows. All right, it's getting late. So up to this point right now, I just wanted to make the point that Saturn is going to be an extremely important thing that we need to study and that we need to acknowledge exists, right? Saturn is more than just a planet that nobody really cares about or that crazy people worship, right? Saturn plays a key role in history, and we need to figure out why it plays that key role. I mean, the associations, they just go on and on, right? American Indian mythology, Greek mythology, you've got Aztec mythology. I mean, all of these ancient cultures have Saturn at some point towards the beginning playing that main role. So we are going to have to start dealing with that, and I'm going to this is the beginning of us going into that. If you are new to Saturn and you've never really thought about it before, hopefully what we can do is we can give you new information that will help you on your studies. And for those of you who are, skeptical, that's fine. But keep an open mind, because for whatever reason, like it or not, Saturn is at the core of a lot of ancient history, and we need to figure out why. The good news is that we actually have a lot of new evidence. Well, I should say new. This study has been going on for like ever, right? For hundreds of years, this study about Saturn and why it's at the core and all of that stuff, it's been going on for a while. But I would say in the past maybe 100-ish years or so, we've actually seen people, great scientists, scholars, etc., make headway into showing us maybe what the hell was going on back in the day. And I completely lost track of what I was saying. This is Saturn, that's right. So, and I've completely lost track of what I was talking about. Saturn, that's right, Saturn. So, all right, we're going to wrap this up. Basically, I just wanted to point out that this is something to think about and something to pay attention to as you start to dive into ancient history. Because if all of these mythologies and religions, etc., have a common core in the planet Saturn, something has to be up. Something has got to be going on. This cannot be a random chance situation, right? I mean, it's weird enough that even one culture, I mean, let's be honest, it's weird enough that even one culture at all would revere Saturn. I mean, there's no reason to do that, especially since mainstream considers all of our ancestors monkeys, basically, right? Up until the past few hundred years. You know, mainstream just absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, but the fact that what you find, and okay, this is what you need to do. When you're done listening to this crap, go just do a quick search on your favorite search engine of choice. As censored as they are, you are going to find this scholarship. It's not hidden, right? Just pick any religion you want and then do a little bit of deep diving. It comes out pretty quick. It's not hidden, and there's a lot of good research on it. Now, this is going to be hard for atheists. I get that, because I know, I understand, you know, atheists, they don't want to read any kind of a religious text and take it seriously as if it has anything to do with history. But the reality is, don't forget, you guys, it does have something to do with history. Even if every single sentence in all of those religious books, and it doesn't matter the religion, but even if every single sentence is fake, fiction, whatever, it's still a historical document, because that gives us an insight to what those people were at least thinking back in the day were a fiction. Right? And that's important. That's like a window into their psychology. So for the atheist friends out there, you know, don't just write this stuff up. I'm not saying go read the Bible or the Torah or the, you know, I'm not saying any of that stuff. You know, the Bhagavad Gita, don't, you know, that one's crazy too. I'm not saying you have to go read these things to get a better understanding of history, but you should. I mean, you should at least not be afraid to you know, entertain somebody who maybe has some good knowledge. Just listen to them. It costs you nothing, and you can expand your mind. Okay, so but I'm not saying that, you know, that stuff is real either. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. Anyway, the point is, go look at this stuff before the next show. Now, I know I have not given the answer to this question, but this show was not about answering the question. All I wanted to do was pose the question. Just throw it out there, because it's a serious problem, right? We cannot ignore what this means or what we see. All of these great scholars have done this great amount of work. To ignore them, you know, just don't do it, right? We got to go over this stuff. And now I'm just rambling. All right, so that's the question. Take a second. It's going to take me like a little bit to make the next part of this video, but go do some research just for fun. Take it as an intellectual exercise, right? It's very important to do that anyway, so here's some homework. You like that? I'm giving you homework on a YouTube video. Yes, you will do the homework that I tell you to do, and you will worship Saturn. What is wrong? All right, if you've listened this far, I mean, you might need, you need to seek help like me. Yeah, all right.